The entire dojo went silent when the black belt shoved the quiet father hard enough to make him stumble into the wooden wall. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Even the instructor seemed frozen for a moment. The father slowly straightened his shirt, looked at the man standing in front of him, and then glanced toward his little daughter sitting near the edge of the mat. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He simply looked tired. But what nobody in that room knew was that this ordinary-looking father had spent years carrying a secret that he had promised himself would never be revealed again. And when the arrogant fighter pushed him a second time, an old instinct buried beneath years of grief finally woke up. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that true strength isn't about hurting others, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dad's Soul Diaries. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has survived battles nobody else can see. The father's name was Jonah Mercer, a 42-year-old widower who lived in a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city with his 12-year-old daughter, Maribel. Jonah worked during the day repairing commercial refrigerators and restaurant equipment. His hands were rough from years of mechanical work, his clothes usually carried the faint smell of metal and grease, and his old pickup truck made an unpleasant noise whenever he turned the steering wheel. To most people, he looked like an ordinary working father trying to keep his life together. But there was something about Jonah that people rarely noticed. He was always watching. Not nervously, but carefully. He noticed doors, windows, exits, people entering a room, and anything that seemed out of place. It was an old habit he couldn't completely erase. Maribel had recently started attending a local martial arts academy because she wanted to become more confident. After losing her mother, she had become withdrawn and easily frightened. Jonah didn't want her to grow up believing the world was something she needed to hide from. He wanted her to learn discipline and confidence without becoming aggressive. So twice a week, he drove her to the dojo, helped her put on her uniform, and then sat quietly against the wall while she trained. The academy was owned by a respected instructor named Soren Bellamy, a former competitor who had spent decades teaching martial arts. Most of his students respected him, but one student stood apart from everyone else. His name was Kellan Rourke, a 28-year-old black belt who had won several regional competitions. Kellan was talented, fast, and powerful, but his confidence had slowly turned into arrogance. Beginners were often nervous around him because he enjoyed showing them how much better he was. When someone made a mistake, Kellan laughed. When someone couldn't keep up, he made sure everyone noticed. For weeks, Kellan watched Jonah sitting quietly near the wall. He noticed that Jonah never cheered loudly, never tried to impress anyone, and never talked about himself. That irritated him. Kellan couldn't understand how a man who looked so ordinary could sit in a martial arts academy without showing the slightest interest in proving himself. One afternoon, while several students were practicing combinations, Kellan walked over and asked Jonah whether he had ever trained. Jonah calmly said that he had many years ago but wasn't interested in returning to competition. Kellan smiled as though he had just found an opportunity. He asked whether Jonah was afraid of being embarrassed. Jonah ignored the insult and told him that he was simply there for his daughter. Kellan laughed loudly enough for several students to look over. He said that maybe Jonah should learn how to defend himself before bringing his daughter into a place where real fighters trained. Jonah looked at him for a moment and then looked back at Maribel. He didn't respond. Soren noticed the exchange and warned Kellan to leave Jonah alone. Kellan eventually walked away, but his pride had been wounded by the father's silence. The following week, Kellan pushed further. During a training session, Maribel accidentally stepped into the wrong position and lost her balance. Kellan laughed from across the room. Jonah immediately stood up, but before he could say anything, Soren corrected the mistake and reassured Maribel. Jonah sat back down. He knew his daughter was watching him. He didn't want her learning that every insult had to become a fight. After class, Kellan approached Jonah again. This time he challenged him directly. He said that if Jonah was going to sit in the dojo every week judging everyone, he should step onto the mat himself. Jonah told him he wasn't interested. Kellan called him weak. Jonah still refused. That refusal made Kellan more determined. The next afternoon, Kellan waited until the dojo was crowded. Parents were sitting along the wall. Children were practicing nearby. Soren was preparing another class. Kellan walked into the center of the room and announced that he wanted to spar with Jonah. Several students looked toward the father. Jonah shook his head. Kellan laughed. He said that apparently Jonah was more comfortable hiding behind his daughter than standing up for himself. Maribel immediately looked worried. That was the moment Jonah's expression changed. Not into anger. Into something deeper. Pain. He looked at his daughter and realized that Kellan's words had reminded him of something he had spent years trying to forget. He stepped onto the mat. The room became quiet. Jonah removed his work jacket and placed it on a bench. Underneath, he wore a plain gray shirt. There was nothing intimidating about him. He didn't have the body of a professional fighter. He didn't wear expensive training gear. He didn't even stretch. Kellan smiled. He told Jonah he would go easy on him. Jonah simply nodded. The sparring began. Kellan moved quickly, throwing a controlled strike toward Jonah's shoulder. Jonah stepped aside. Another came. Jonah moved again. Kellan tried a low sweep, but Jonah shifted his foot just enough to avoid it. The students began whispering. Kellan attacked faster. Jonah continued moving. He wasn't fighting. He was observing. His eyes followed Kellan's shoulders, hips, and feet. He watched the tiny movements that happened before every strike. Kellan didn't realize it, but Jonah was reading him like a map. Kellan suddenly rushed forward. Jonah moved one step to the side. Kellan stumbled past him. A few students gasped. Kellan turned around, embarrassed. His pride took control. He attacked again, harder this time. Jonah blocked the strike and gently redirected Kellan's momentum. Kellan lost his balance and dropped to one knee. Jonah immediately released him. He offered a hand. Kellan refused it. He stood up furious. He demanded another round. Soren stepped forward and told him to stop. But Kellan ignored the instructor. He rushed toward Jonah. This time, Jonah's instincts took over. In one controlled motion, he caught Kellan's wrist, shifted his weight, redirected the attack, and brought Kellan safely to the mat. There was no unnecessary force. No dramatic strike. No attempt to hurt him. Just complete control. The dojo fell silent. Jonah released him immediately. Kellan stared at the ceiling, breathing heavily. He had no idea what had just happened. Neither did most of the students. But Soren did. The instructor looked closely at Jonah's stance. He asked where he had learned to move like that. Jonah said it was a long time ago. Soren asked again. Jonah didn't answer. Then one of the older students noticed a faded scar running along Jonah's forearm. Soren's eyes narrowed. He asked whether Jonah had served in the military. Jonah looked toward his daughter. He had promised himself that she would never have to know. But the secret was already beginning to surface. Jonah finally admitted that he had served overseas. Soren asked what unit. Jonah remained silent. Then Kellan slowly sat up. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was curious. Jonah finally revealed that before becoming a mechanic and a father, he had been part of an elite military rescue unit. He had spent years entering dangerous places to bring people home. He had been trained to remain calm when everyone else was panicking. He had learned how to fight, but more importantly, he had learned when not to fight. Years earlier, Jonah had led a rescue operation after a disaster overseas. His team had been sent to evacuate trapped civilians from a collapsing structure. They succeeded in getting most of the civilians out, but one of Jonah's closest teammates, Elias Venn, never made it home. Jonah carried the memory for years. After leaving the service, he married Maribel's mother and tried to build an ordinary life. For a while, it worked. Then his wife died unexpectedly. Jonah became a single father. And he decided that the past was finished. He never wore his old uniform. He never displayed his medals. He never talked about his missions. He wanted Maribel to know him simply as Dad. That was why he had refused to fight Kellan. Not because he was afraid. Because he knew exactly what violence could cost. Kellan stared at him. The arrogance had disappeared from his face. He realized that while he had been training to win trophies, Jonah had once been training to bring people home alive. Kellan asked Jonah why he had allowed him to insult him. Jonah looked at him and said that sometimes walking away was harder than fighting. Those words struck Kellan harder than any technique. The dojo became quiet again. Maribel walked toward her father. She asked whether he had really been a soldier. Jonah knelt beside her.